Part 4. In this section, we will talk a little bit about the prevalence of human trafficking in Canada, why it's so challenging to get good sightlines on this issue, and walk you through some novel research from the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking that has an interesting nexus for the gaming and casino industry. Historically, our national understanding of human trafficking has typically been based on data collected via the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey, which is collected from police services across Canada. Relying on this one type of data to quantify the scope of trafficking is incredibly problematic. As I mentioned in part 1 of the training, reluctance of equity-seeking groups to interact with formal institutions has led to fewer officially reported trafficking cases. The StatsCan data largely represents cases of police-identified or reported cases of sex trafficking. However, labor trafficking is significantly underrepresented. And we know that as with other crimes like sexual assault, there is a low self-report rate amongst survivors who are choosing not to engage with the formal criminal justice process. While this data is imperfect, it does share some important findings. Number one, that most victims are trafficked by someone they know. 1/3 of victims report being trafficked by a current or former intimate partner. That men between the ages of 18 and 34 make up 2/3 of people accused of this offense, although female traffickers represented a lower proportion at 17%. The vast majority, so 89% of human trafficking charges in Canada were stayed, withdrawn, dismissed, or discharged. Currently, Canada has a completion rate of just 12% for human trafficking related charges. Survivors are typically not being served well by the criminal justice system. The Centre published its first report utilizing anonymized data from the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. This first of its kind data set in Canada provided us with some larger trends and takeaways that confirmed what has been understood anecdotally in the Canadian anti-trafficking movement for a long time. In the first year of hotline operations, we noted 415 unique cases of trafficking that represented 593 victims and survivors. 1 in 3 callers to the hotline identified as a victim or survivor of trafficking. 14% of victims identified themselves as foreign nationals, which means about 86% were Canadian citizens or permanent residents. 90% of victims and survivors identified as female. Transgender and gender diverse individuals represent 2% of all calls from victims and survivors to the hotline, despite comprising just 0.24% of the total Canadian population. We recognize that transgender and gender diverse people are experiencing trafficking at higher rates compared to their overall population size. 44% of victims and survivors access the hotline during their trafficking experience, and 26% of all calls came from family and friends of a potential trafficking victim. The next few slides will touch on some of the larger trends that the report also identified. Trend 1 found evidence to support the notion that sex and labor trafficking are the most common forms of human trafficking in Canada. Trend 2, that human trafficking is a gender-based crime and must be treated as such. Again, that 90% of victims identified as cisgender females. And again, you can see that overrepresentation of transgender and gender diverse individuals. Human trafficking victims and survivors were the largest caller type, about 1 in 3, followed by social service providers and then family members. We also recognize that accessing the disparate, underfunded social support network is incredibly challenging for trafficking survivors. The center's data shows that 69% of all requests for services were for emergency shelter and housing, followed by 22% of referrals that came in for supportive counseling, and then 19% for case management. Family and friends. So trend number 5, family and friends are uniquely positioned to identify the early stages of grooming and luring and assist survivors. We know that much more education and awareness is needed for communities and families. Finally, COVID had a significantly negative impact on an already difficult to navigate social service sector. 3 years on, we recognize that many of the programs and partners have not necessarily rebounded to levels that they were at pre-pandemic. The Human Trafficking Corridors Report in Canada, published by the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking in 2021, was the first ever study of these human trafficking specific transportation corridors or routes in Canada. Again, this is something that the anti trafficking sector had long been discussing anecdotally. The report notes that traffickers benefit from transportation routes across the country for three main reasons. First, it allows them to move between commercial sex markets to obtain as much profit as possible. Movement allows them to lower risks associated with the trafficking activity since movement across municipal, provincial jurisdictions makes it harder for law enforcement to detect, investigate, and pursue human trafficking cases. It also allows them to maximize and maintain control over the individuals they are exploiting by reinforcing their social and physical isolation and keeping the victims confused and dependent on the trafficker. The report quotes a law enforcement respondent who stated, "The shorter amount of time spent in each city, the more beneficial it is for the traffickers. It takes time for police to set up an investigation. If they are only in town for a couple days, it's harder to track." Traffickers know this, and they are using this to their advantage. In the next section, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on this report and again talk about how it intersects with the gaming industry. The corridors identified in this report do not exist for the sole purpose of human trafficking. These are primary transportation routes across Canada that are being used for other purposes, including transporting people and goods to various markets. And along these corridors, traffickers are often using smaller circuits, which are really just regular tours around an assigned district or territory. Cars are by far the most frequent used method of travel on these corridors, especially along the circuits, the human trafficking circuits. The overhead costs associated with driving are lower than for air travel, and traffickers can be nimble and adjust travel routes according to the demand for commercial sexual services. We also know that cars and rentals can be hired in the name of the victim, allowing the trafficker to remain one step removed from the trafficking operations. The corridors report also identified a number of key interprovincial corridors that are accessed by land and by air. The Trans-Canada Highway in particular functions as a corridor that connects commercial sex markets within all provinces and across the country. The red markers you see here, which contain the red dye, indicate locations of casinos that are on or very close by to this particular human trafficking corridor. Our research indicates that interprovincial corridors occur when traffickers transport victims across provinces to access those markets. They are largely organized around accessing the most competitive and highest paying markets. And because those additional costs associated with flying and driving long distance, interprovincial corridors tend to run between large urban centers with large markets. Once a trafficker and a victim arrive in a new province, they may stay to capitalize on the major urban commercial sex market in the city of arrival, or they may access other intra-provincial corridors within the province. Women and girls of Canadian nationality made up the vast majority of sex trafficking victims and survivors that were identified by both frontline service agencies and law enforcement respondents for this study. Only a small proportion of law enforcement, at 10%, and service provider respondents at 16% reported having worked previously with male or trans-identified survivors. Of note, 53% of service providers and 40% of law enforcement respondents indicated that they had worked with survivors identifying as Indigenous. Indigenous women and girls are more likely to experience trafficking after traveling to urban centers from rural communities for reasons unrelated to exploitation, such as medical appointments, to access education, or to seek employment opportunities. Once in an unfamiliar urban area, Indigenous women and girls may be targeted by traffickers, or they may engage in high-risk survival sex to meet their basic needs, such as access to food and shelter, which again makes them more at risk for being targeted for trafficking. Ontario's 401 highway connects Montreal, Quebec, and Windsor, Ontario, and between these two endpoints, there are several populous urban centers. Traffickers may choose to operate along the entire 401 corridor or capitalize on movement through this densely populated region, such as the Greater Toronto Area. You can see with the smaller red dots a number of populous destination cities along the 401 corridor and a number of casinos that are next to or within close proximity to this corridor. When interviewees were asked about the sectors or types of trafficking engaged with specifically along the trafficking corridors, over half of service providers and 90% of law enforcement officers interviewed for this report reported the widespread use of escort services to facilitate trafficking. Although other typologies of trafficking emerged from the interviews, they were not identified as using these trafficking corridors. This is likely because other forms of trafficking, such as illicit massage, pornography, and personal sexual servitude, likely rely on the trafficker having a stable location for that kind of exploitation to occur. Within Atlantic Canada, the stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway between Halifax and Moncton was the most frequently mentioned corridor by interviewees and is the most well-known human trafficking corridor in that part of the country. Traffickers go to Moncton not only to connect to online commercial sex market, but also to access the commercial markets in strip clubs. While strip clubs are permitted to operate in New Brunswick, they are not legally permitted in Nova Scotia. As you can see, Halifax, Truro, and Moncton represent destination markets for sexual activity, commercial sexual activity, and both Moncton and Halifax each have a casino there. The Quebec to Alberta corridor was one of the most commonly identified by interviewees, with a noticeable trend of trafficking of young women from Quebec into central and western Canada, most notably Alberta. Law enforcement respondents specifically noted the trafficking of victims from Montreal to Calgary by airplane. So you see those black lines there, those are the air routes. Victims either traveled with their trafficker or may travel alone, or maybe they're met by the trafficker or an associate upon arrival in Alberta. Traffickers and victims may stay in Calgary to arrange commercial sex interactions in hotels near the airport or downtown, or traffickers may move victims along the interprovincial corridor between Calgary and Fort McMurray, which we will see in a later slide. This is a visual representation of the types of recruitment that were identified by research respondents. Trafficker types can be understood according to the methods they use to traffic people and the business models under which they operate. Service providers are noted in red, whereas law enforcement respondents are noted in black. You will see that both groups were similar in identifying boyfriend traffickers and organized gangs as the two most significant trafficking types. Respondents also noticed a strong interplay between gang-related traffickers and boyfriend-style traffickers, but found it really difficult to determine whether gang members use Romeo trafficking techniques to maintain strong psychological holds on the victims, to traffic them as part of the gang's criminal activities, or if boyfriend traffickers are also gang affiliated but not necessarily trafficking on behalf of their gang. The vast majority of respondents describe traffickers as male, so 84% of service providers and 90% of law enforcement reported as such. And of note, 40% of law enforcement respondents and 39% of service provider respondents said that they had worked with victims and survivors who had been trafficked by other women. Within Alberta, human trafficking corridors connect the province's largest online commercial sex markets, while also accessing markets affiliated with extraction work camps in Fort McMurray and Grand Prairie. This corridor is used by both traffickers local to Alberta and those from outside the province. Mentioned earlier was the noticeable uptick from Ontario and Quebec. A growing trend for this particular corridor is the number of victims and survivors coming from central to eastern Canada. Women being trafficked into Alberta with little to no English not only have language barriers that serve as another method of control, but this is believed that sex buyers may see women from Quebec as exotic and novel.